Hi there. This tutorial is just to give you a very basic understanding of how Vinci Resolve works and the layout of the program. So I'll show you some of the pages that you can go to do different tasks, and then I'll give you, at the end of that, I'll give you a brief run through of some of the things that I do to my footage to work with the 8K raw footage from the Canon R5 and also the 4K footage from the Canon R5, and really just to give you an overview of what's possible with the program. And it's a free program, so anybody making film or interested in making film or interested in moving images really should just download this program, because it's probably one of the best tools out there. And as I said, it's free, so why wouldn't you, quite honestly? Let's get straight into it then. So here we are in the first page of DaVinci Resolve. This is the bottom menu here. You can see there are 7 different pages. So you've got the media page. This is where you bring in all your media. It's just a big pool really of all your footage. Then the next page is the cut page. This is a very simple editor, and you can see all the clips that I've dragged in. These are the clips I've dragged in from my media pool, and I've just dumped them in here. It's very easy to move around, and to trim clips you can just pull them. It's really for people that are doing rush edits for sort of news and media and that sort of thing. But then from there you go to the full edit page, which is the third page here, and this is the same edit that was that I just showed you in the cut page here. This is more or less like any other video editing sequencer. So again, you can just easily edit things. You can split clips and cut stuff and all the usual things you do in your video editing sequencer. The next page, fourth page, we've got Fusion. Fusion is a special effects area where you can do fancy bits and pieces to your footage. And the way it works is you've basically got an input here. This is the footage being input, and this is the footage being output. And whatever you do in between is what happens to the footage. So, for example, this footage with the lettering on, if I look in Fusion what I did, I can show you very briefly. So the footage is coming in here. I've inserted a tracker in between the footage coming in and the footage going out. The tracker has tracked that little bush on the top of the hill there, just up there. And then I connected a text node, connected it to the tracker, and in the text node I have typed the word Chanctonbury Ring. Once it's connected and you play the footage back, it's tracking with the footage. Then the next page is where the program really has its forte, and it's this page here, which is the color page. I'll come back to this one. Then you've got the Fairlight page here, which is an audio processing page, and you can do a huge amount with your audio. You've got your input, and then you've got effects here, all sorts of different effects, Fairlight effects, VST effects, AU effects. Finally, the last page is your delivery page, which is where you send the final edit out to wherever you want to send it to. So, and you can also select what you want to output. So, for instance, you could output just this bit here. And once you've selected your output, your render range, you select your audio, video file types. Then you come to File to name your file. And then once you've decided what you want to call your file and where you want to put it, you just click on Add to Render, and it appears up here as a job in the render queue. Once you start render by clicking this button, that will be output to wherever you decided you wanted it to go. Going back now to the start of all of that, I'll show you some of these top menus here. So this menu up here, when I click on it, it opens up the hierarchy of folders on my computer. This is my HD here. This is me. And this is my desktop, and these are the clips for this tutorial. So once you've got your stuff brought into the program, I generally ignore the cut page and just go straight to the edit page. With the media pool on, you can grab your clips. It shows you which part of the clip I've used with these little red lines here. So once you've got your clips brought into the show, then you go on to the Fusion page if you've got anything you want to do on there. We're not going to use that for this tutorial. Then we come to the color page, which is really what this program is developed to do best. You've got your gallery where you can save stills. These aren't just stills, these are actually stills that contain all the information about the grade. So if I delete all of this and take it right back to what came out of the camera, which is that, I can reapply that grade very easily just by clicking on apply grade and it all comes back. Or I can apply that grade from this shot here to that still, so you get a completely different look. Depending on what your story is, you might want to go for something more like this. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the process of how I would color this and how it all works. I'll just explain how the node system works. So you've got an input here and an output here, and the nodes will be placed in between the input and the output, and it's really just like a circuit. So the signal comes in, it goes into the first node, something happens to it, it goes into the next node, something happens to it, it goes into the next node, something happens to it, and it gets to the end of the chain, and then it goes into the output there. Each node, you can do any number of things with the node. I tend to try to keep a single node for a single operation. So I would save the first node in case I need to go back to it and put noise reduction on it. So I would start with the first node and keep that one free. And then I would add another node, the second node. This is where I would look at the contrast of the shot. And there's any number of ways of fixing the contrast. You can either use these color wheels. They basically work on lift for shadows, gamma for midtones, and gain for highlights, and then this is an offset which will shift the whole image either up or down in the brightness scale. And then under each wheel you've got a color bias, so you can push that part of the image into any part of the color spectrum that you want, and then you've got a value here for light or dark. That was your primary wheels. Over here you've got your curves. This area here has a whole number of different menus. You've got a qualifier to pick certain colors to make masks, which I'll go into in a little while. You've got your mask window. These are all different types of masks for use on the image. You've got a tracker, you've got a blur and a sharpen tool. You've got the node key level. If you were in Photoshop, that would be the opacity of the layer. So it affects the amount that your node is going to operate. Let's start with this second node and look at contrast. You can just go straight for the contrast knob and whack it up and down. I tend to prefer to use curves because you've got a little bit more of a control, and you've also got this graph here which helps you. And I cannot stress enough the need to use scopes. I use these all the time. You can't rely on your eyes when you're doing this kind of work because the light in the room will affect your eyes. Your judgment will be affected by whether it's daylight or nighttime. You're always going to need to use scopes to know that you've got you've nailed the color properly. But there's a few different versions. So this is a waveform of the RGB, the red, green, and the blue all together. And what you're looking at here is a representation of this image. So as the image moves, that representation will change as well. So this part here is the brightest part of the image. Actually, the brightest part of the image is this part here by this photograph. And you can see that here where it's sticking right up almost into the white area. This represents total white up the top and total black at the bottom and everything in between. If you look at the white here, I've clicked it with this dropper. It's now shown you on the graph where that white lives, and you can see it's quite low down. You'd think it would be up here in the up towards the top, but it's not. It's actually not a a totally white, and that's shown here as well in this graph, where you can see it's not actually at the top, it's kind of above the middle somewhere. What I do is I turn off all the color information, and as I desaturate this image, you'll see all these lines will come together. When it's just a black and white image, the red, green, and blue values are all totally identical. So there's no difference in the red, green, and blue channels. That's the same if you look at this waveform in 3 separate waveforms, one each for each color. This is the same waveform, so that's his face there. That's that bright section there. And that white section of the photograph is shown by this peak here. And as I take all the color out of the picture, those 3 waveforms will all become exactly the same. It's useful to do that because then when you're adjusting contrast, you can just make sure that you're in the right ballpark with all 3 channels. So it's very simple. I just come to the curves. The first curve is a custom curve, and you can either use it with red, green, and blue individually, or you can use them all together. I just pull that like that and bring this lowest black, see the black spot there? That's kind of the darkest part of the image. I'll just bring that down so that it's almost touching the bottom. Give it a little bit of leeway. And then I'll push the highlights up somewhere around about here. So there's still some detail in the skin tones there. And already you can see with that node on the image, it's already got much more contrast in it. So I'll now go back and put the color information back into it. I'll just show you that's with that node on and that's with the node off. So it's just putting more contrast into the image before we start doing anything else with it. So I'll just label that. That one's called contrast. It's time for another node. So in the third node, we're going to look at saturation. I'm just using this to push it up. There are a number of ways you can do it, either with the saturation here, or there's also the RGB mixer. Some people like to just push everything up to the top and then pull it back later so that you're using the full amount of color information in the shot. But for this instance, I'm going to use this saturation level here. So it's a bit desaturated before I add the node, and then with the node, it brings in all the color information. Label that, saturation. The next thing to do is to select the skin. The idea is you select the skin to maintain the skin tones, and then you can alter the rest of the image. To select the skin, we go to this second tool here, which is a little pipette, and you can just select the tones that you want to select. And then what it'll do is it'll set the hue, the saturation, and the luminance channels down here to operate only in the skin tone area. So we make sure that our selector is on selection. There's also, you can add or subtract, but we want it on the main selection here. And we want this, see this little button up here, that turns on the mask. So we want the masking on so we can see what we've selected, and then you just click and drag across his skin like that. And this is where you can see that the image is a little bit noisy because it's sort of broken up in some places. And if I add noise reduction to this first node, it would get rid of that. But I'm just not going to bother doing that for now because it's a bit too much to deal with. We've probably selected too much. I'm going to go back and redo it. I would say something like this. And then you can feather using this feather tool into the shadow area and onto his lips. That's looking better. I might just add his lips to it. Like that. And if you want to get rid of some of this background stuff, one little trick you can do is you can go in here to the masking, add a mask, feather it out, change the shape of it a little bit, rotate it slightly so it sort of sits on his face. You click on tracker, track forwards, and that's in real time. I didn't speed that up. That's how fast it does it, and then track back. So I've now tracked that whole shot with that mask. We'll come back to that in a sec. The next node we need is shortcut Option S, get a new node. This is where we're going to grade this image and cool it all down and get rid of some of this warmth in the background and bring out the blues in his eyes and shirt, etc. So you can either do this in curves or you can do it using these color wheels. One way to do it would be to pull the color wheel down in the shadows, making the shadows cooler. You can push back for the mid-tones for the skin, but we're going to bring his skin back anyway, so it's just another way of kind of cooling out the image a bit. And I haven't been looking at my scopes, so I must look. I've now got to have a look at the scopes. So always bring your scopes up when you're doing this, or you're going to make the same mistake I've just been making where I've lightened the shadows up too much. You can see how high the blue and green is in the shadow area. So I'm going to drop the shadows back down now. And you can see how much darker that's become and how much colder it looks. In the mid-tones here, here, and here, you could probably push the blue a tiny bit more, or even the red, push the blue down a bit more. That's using the primary wheels. That's one way of doing it. I'll just call that grade. I'm going to turn that node off and show you how you can do it on another node in the curves. It's basically doing the same thing but using a different technique. So in the curves, if you go to your red channel, you're going to want to keep the red information in the highlights, but in the shadows, you can just drop all the red out. You can probably pull down the green a little bit, or maybe let's increase the blue rather. A bit more blue in the shadows. And you can see when I'm doing this that these scopes are showing exactly what I'm doing to the image. So yeah, something like that. And then I would go back to the brightness and probably add a bit more contrast by pulling the shadows down and pushing the highlights a little bit up. So you can see how I've taken out all the warmth from the image, but it's also destroying his skin tone. It's making him look a bit ill. So this is where we go back to this skin selection that we made. So what you do with the skin is, imagine this is a Photoshop layer, and we want to put another layer on top where we keep the skin preserved. And the way to do that is with what's called a layer node. So to create a layer node, if I right click on this node, you'll see add node, add layer node. If it was in Photoshop, it would be on top. So this node, this layer of this node is on top of this layer. So what we need to do is use this mask from the skin node to mask this node. And the way to do that is, if you see this blue connector here, you can click on it and drag and pull a cable, a virtual wire, and plug it into this triangle connection here. So this node is now masked. Everything on it is masked apart from the skin. So when this node is on, we are masking out the skin, so the skin's not getting the grade from this grade node up here. So if I turn this mask off, you can see the skins turn more blue like that. And if I turn the mask on, it brings all the skin tones back. So what you can do is you can create all these atmospheric shots, but all the skin tones are correct. And you can actually check your skin tones by going into this vector scope, and this line here is where skin should lie. It's in the settings somewhere. Show skin tone indicator. So when you turn it on, you get this line, and that's just a guide to show you that you're putting all your skin tones in the right area. This is now operating as our skin, so I'm going to label that skin. Using this node, we can apply different effects to his skin. So for example, you can soften the skin, the detail of the skin, So if you look at the detail of his skin here, and I pull down this mid-tone detail, it softens his skin, or I can bring more detail into the skin. You could then add another node and sharpen the eyes if you wanted. I mean, I can do that probably quickly. Add a layer node, another layer on top, mask that with that one, then I can just put a mask around the eyes. Like that. So that, where is it? Inside and outside softness. Outside softness. So, if I show you the mask, that's what it's doing. Zoom in here. You can add some sharpening to those eyes. So, I'll just be subtle with it. 47 maybe. Probably enough. And then if you look at the eyes now with that node on, you get that little bit of extra detail in the eyes there. After that section, I would probably add a node. I'll just bring this one down here. I would probably do like an overall adjustment at that stage. So this would be somewhere where I might kind of look at the image and just think, am I going a bit too green in the shadows? Or you might want to lift the shadows slightly. That's kind of pretty much it. And one thing I would say about this image is that the shadows are very saturated. So I would add a new node now and go into one of these curves here. Yeah, this one is called luminance versus saturation. So the way this works is this is a representation of your image from shadows here to highlights here. This is your midtones in the middle. And if you select a point somewhere around about here, which is representing your lower mid-tones going into dark black, you can drop the saturation in the dark blacks. So I don't know if you noticed the image change when I did that. This bit of his shirt just became completely less saturated, or more. If I push it up there, it's more saturated. That's a good trick for keeping your shadows desaturated. Maybe not completely desaturated, but somewhere like that. And that gives it a more filmic look. So that would be desaturation. Then you might want to add a vignette around the whole image, and the way to do that is to go into the masks, add a circular mask, feather it, stretch it out. You don't need to track this. This is just for the whole shot. So the way this works is you create an outside node, which basically inverts what you did on that node. And so you can see that the mask has changed to the opposite on this one. So on this node, you then darken the image, which will only happen around the areas that are not masked. That kind of brings the background down. So we've gone from the shot straight out of camera that looks like this to the final image, which looks like this. So we've tried to keep the interest on the boy's face throughout that whole shot. And his skin tones are great. His eyes look great. The blue looks lovely. And there's no sort of real distraction from the action that's going on in the center of the image there. And that's that shot. As I said before, you can save a still from that shot, and then you can apply that same grade to another image. So for example, this image, if I run the cursor over that still of the boy, it will give you a preview of what this image could look like with that grade. It's a lot pinker on her face. Also, you can group clips. So for example, these three here, you can see I've grouped them with this little chain link. When you group some clips together, you get a choice of grading them as a clip, individual clips, or you can grade them as a group. So whatever I do in this node here will affect the entire group. So it's a fast way of working, because if you shoot 30 clips with a drone and you want to grade them all together and they're all pretty much the same lighting, you can just group everything in the entire timeline. Do a group grade. If it didn't quite work with the group grade, you can still do stuff on the clip individually. So what I would do normally is I would do all the work in the group clip, group grade, and then go back to the clip just to do a tiny adjustment, maybe with 1 or 2 nodes. This is an 8K shot from the Canon R5, and it's difficult to play it because my computer struggles to play 8K footage, especially when it's got a lot of processing on it. What I do is I just bring it into the computer, park the playhead on a shot that looks like one that I can work with, and then I just work with that, and then by the time I've finished it and put it out as HD footage, I can edit with it. This is what you see when it comes out of the camera. The second node, I've added contrast. As before, I've brought the black point further into the shot just to bring these down to the bottom of the parade. And you'll notice that the sunlight is being represented by these high points here. You can just tweak them down a bit like that if you want. Or one other way of doing that would be over here with your color wheels. You've not only got the primary wheels, but you've also got your primary bars, which is another way of doing the same thing. It's just a different representation of it. But then you've also got log wheels, which operate slightly differently. In the primary wheels, when you adjust your values on the gain, for example, if you watch this chart here, you'll see it squashes the whole image down towards the black point. And if you move the black point, it squashes the whole image up towards white. But with log wheels, it works slightly differently in a kind of logarithmic way, I guess. And instead of squashing everything down, it will just bring this part of the image down when I move the top end, which can be to your advantage. And same with the bottom. When I move the bottom, it just brings the bottom up. It doesn't affect the whole image. The saturation, I just pushed all the RGB mixer channels up to their max. So this is giving me the full amount of color information stored in the file to work with. And then I moved on to some curves to do a kind of basic grade. You can see here that I've taken the warmth out of the shadows, and I've added some blue and green, very small amounts. On this last one, I've gone into the primary wheels and I've pushed a lot of warmth into the midtones here. More sort of red, pink into the midtones, a bit of yellow, orange yellow into the highlights, and the shadows I've put a tiny bit more sort of blue, green, cyan, and brought them down a bit there. If we add another node, we can look at our log wheels to maybe try and bring this peak a little bit closer to white. I think it's maybe a bit too green. So to get away from green, we need to push towards pink. So that's with that node and that's without it. So it just gives you that little bit of punch right in that sun area. Hopefully that's some help and allays some people's fears of how this all works. It's a massive piece of software. You can do so many things with it. And if you just take it step by step, it's very easy to get into. And, you know, I've just taught myself to use it. I've not been on a course or anything. It's just, I find it fascinating how you can play with the images and what you can do with them. I don't actually like this grade anymore. I think I want to change it. It's horrible. I'm just playing around with a little effect here to try and get the bleach bypass look. I've added a serial node here and desaturated it, so we're getting a black and white image. This is the mixer that mixes these two nodes together. This is called the layer mixer, and you can go into the composite mode. If we choose overlay, you start seeing that kind of silver tone image that's used a lot in the movies, and you can adjust the amount by going into the key input, key output page and just putting it back to where you think it works best. So somewhere here is quite nice. So that's how it came out of camera, and this is what we're looking at now. So you can see that's made it much more gritty and hard. You could also, at the end of this whole chain, add another node and put some film grain onto that. Add film grain, so plonk that on there, bring the grain right up, increase the size maybe. So you can see how now we've gone from the shot from the camera to looking something quite cinematic and hard and fitting the genre of the story. It's a drama, by the way. Going back to this shot here, this is a little tip. If you're having problems with your white balance in the shot, you've got a little eyedropper down here. If you click on that and bring it up to your image and just click on the area that you want to be totally white, that brings that image back to proper white. That's with that and that's without it. So it's just sorted out the white balance in the white areas. That's it. That's DaVinci Resolve in a nutshell. I mean, there are hundreds of different ways of doing every task. I've only shown you a couple of ways that I use, but I'm learning all the time, and I can't recommend it more highly. Download the program from Blackmagic and have a go yourself and see what you can come up with. It's all a learning curve, and if you've got any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll do what I can to answer. Thanks for watching.